Hello everyone and welcome to a new video. So today we're going to talk about integration scenarios between Azure API Management and Azure AD B2C. Some of these concepts can be applied to any OAuth provider, and we're going to discuss to what extent that is. If you don't have any experience with Azure API Management or Azure AD B2C, then you probably need to go and take an overview first before you watch this video. I'll try as much as possible to boil down the concepts so that they're easily understood, however. So if you want to continue watching this video, go ahead and do so. So the first thing I usually start my videos with is usually, why you would want to do that sort of integration. Like, what are the use cases where this is going to be useful? And there are 4 scenarios that you can do here in integration between APIM and B2C. So we'll go ahead and take a look at those scenarios one by one, and we'll explain the differences between all of them. So the first scenario allows you to authenticate developers using Azure AD B2C. And all that means is that on the APIM portal, you can get this button to authenticate your developers using B2C. Now that doesn't do anything to the APIM gateway or backend APIs or anything like that. It's fairly cosmetic. It just allows the users from your B2C tenant to log into the APIM portal, and you can then, after the user is onboarded, you can assign to them to groups, you can assign to them subscriptions, and you can treat them as a part of your APIM ecosystem, so that you can do the metering and all of that. It makes no difference here whether the account was created by or onboarded from B2C or actually a local account created on the APIM product itself. Now moving on to the second scenario, it allows you to authorize developer accounts using Azure AD B2C. And what that does is it allows developers to issue tokens from B2C to use on the API calls right from within the developer portal. Now, that is also fairly cosmetic. It doesn't do anything to the API gateway itself or how the API call gets processed or any of that. All it does is that if you were successfully able to issue a token from this directory, then it would add an authorization bearer header right here, whereby the JWT token is passed through to your API. Now, if your API doesn't want to do anything with it, or the API gateway doesn't do anything with it, that's a different matter. It just provides you with this bit of interface right here. Now, the third scenario can actually secure an API using Azure AD B2C. And it basically places a lock on the APIM gateway for specific APIs that validates the JWT that is passed against, whether to see whether it was a valid token issued by B2C or not. And now, if you do that, then the user or app actually has to provide a token issued from B2C before being able to contact the APIM gateway. And that is most commonly used to streamline security requirements for backend APIs, meaning that if your backend API, is internal, unprotected, or using a different security mechanism that does not depend on B2C whatsoever, you can streamline the security mechanisms for all your backend APIs to instead use this, validation through the token issued by B2C. And then the backend call can be whatever it is. It can be unprotected or it can be protected using a different mechanism. But the user or the app are only going to see this part. They're only going to interact with this part. So they have to provide a valid token in order to be able to talk to your API gateway. The fourth scenario handles the authorization between the gateway and the backend. So suppose, for example, you have a backend API and that backend API is already secured using B2C. Now, the user might not be able to issue that kind of token for any reason. However, you want the API call to still go through, maybe using a different security mechanism that you use on your APIM gateway, but you want the APIM gateway itself to be able to issue tokens from B2C to be able to call the backend API. So in that scenario, the APIM gateway actually talks to BDC, issues a token, and then uses that token to contact the backend API that is already protected by BDC. You can combine this scenario with the previous scenario in case you have you want the user to authenticate to a single tenant, but then you want the backend API to be secured by a different tenant, for example. So it's pretty useful in that regard. Now I know what you're going to say. Is APIM Gateway going to issue a token for every new API request? And in our example here, the answer is yes. But of course, you should use that with caution. You should implement some kind of token caching or mechanism where you don't issue a token every time. You first check to see if there is a token still existing and if it's still valid. And then if not, then issue a new token, otherwise use the existing token. So that might be something you want to consider. Or to be honest, I would not use this mechanism at all if I have the option to use client certificates instead, which are much more streamlined. So in a nutshell, those are the 4 scenarios we're going to discuss, and we're going to take a look at how to implement them now one by one. So now going back to the first scenario here, let's take a look at what we have provisioned so far. So the first thing we have is an API management service. So this instance is new. The only thing I've done is that I've provisioned the developer portal. So I just came here, open the developer portal, and then click publish. I've also enabled cores just because I don't want to face any issues with talking to backend APIs on a different domain. And here we can see the developer portal that I've provisioned. So if you click sign in right here, you will see that, yeah, indeed you can sign up and sign in, but this is not connected to Azure AD B2C at all. This is what comes attached into API Management Service. So we also have an Azure AD B2C tenant, and this is a brand new tenant. There is nothing provisioned on this tenant at all, and we're going to take it step by step from here. I also have this API, and it's just a weather API, dummy API that just brings in a bunch of weather information when you call it. It has only a single controller, weather forecast. So just to show you what it looks like, I can go ahead and make a request, and there is the result. Now that same API is actually published onto this URL as well, so it has a public URL so that API management can reach it, and it brings the same result. So that's actually all we have. So let's go ahead and start provisioning. There is the guide on how to set up the first scenario, and I'll put all the links for all the guides into the description so that you can find it as well, along with all the code and everything. So the first thing here is just to go ahead and create a user flow. So let's go ahead and do that. So I go to my B2C tenant, create a user flow. Now you might already have a user flow built in. This will also work with custom policies. There is no difference whatsoever. And I'll just call it sign up, sign in, email sign up. And now I need specific claims to be presented to the application here. I'll just get the display name, collect the email address, and present it in the token, given name, surname, and I'll also present the object ID. I think that's all you need. You will find the exact claims in the guide, but I also usually like to present whether the user is new, because I use that user flow for a bunch of different things. So we will create that. Good, and now that the user flow has been created successfully, we can move on to the next step. And the next step is to go ahead and configure the identity provider. So we need to go back to the APIM and click on identities right here. And now we need to add a new identity provider. Of course, we already have the built-in username and password identity provider, but now we want to add Azure Active Directory B2C. So we need to put a client ID and a client secret. So I'm just going to show you how to get all that stuff. So the first thing we need to create is an app registration that represents APIM. So I'll just call it with the same name as the APIM instance so that I can find it later on easily. I'll leave this empty right now, and I'll just click register. Good, so now I'll just copy the application ID and put it right here. I also need to get an application secret. So client secret, and I'll just call it APIM. Now I can copy this value and put it into the application secret right here. The sign-in tenant, this is going to be something like the name of my BDC tenant .onmicrosoft.com, and it also automatically detected that this is the authority name. That's what you need to put in here. So the sign up sign in policy, this is going to be B2C _1 _ and the sign in policy is the same because this is a sign up sign in policy. You can have two different policies. You could use a profile editing policy and a password reset policy. I'm not going to do that. It's optional. But if you have them, go ahead and do it. And then this is the redirect URI. So I'm going to copy that redirect URI right here. And I'm going to go back to my application registration, go to authentication. And I'm going to add a platform. This is a web platform. And I'm going to paste this right here. I'll leave the logout URL empty for now, and I need to also allow the implicit grant on hybrid workflows. So I'm gonna present the access token and ID token. Good, now that's done. I can go ahead and add this right here. Okay, so now that this is added, I can go ahead and republish the portal. So I can come here to portal overview again, and you need to republish the portal after you do this for it to take effect. So I'm gonna republish the portal again. And it takes a couple of minutes to take effect, and then go back to the developer portal, sign in, and now you should be able to see Azure Active Directory B2C here. So I'm gonna click this button, and now it should pop up to me the user flow that should allow me to log in using Azure Active Directory B2C. Now I don't actually have an account with Azure AD B2C, so I'm gonna sign up to create one. And now I'm signed in. If I click on my profile, you can see all the account details here. They came in successfully, so that's good for me. So what does that do really? Well, not much. I just can sign in right now. I could still see the APIs even if I was not signed in. However, let's try this API. And you can see here, I have to go get a subscription key. So now one of the benefits of doing this is that now I have a user account on APIM, which the APIM administrator can go ahead and attach a subscription key for me. So let's go ahead and do that. So I can come here to users, and I should find my username right here. And if I click it, I can click on subscriptions. I can add a subscription, and now I can create a brand new subscription. Let's call this developers, and it has access to all the APIs, and create. All right, now if I go back to my developer portal and just refresh this page, I'm still signed in, and now it knows that, this is the subscription key I can use. So that's one main benefit here, is that because I'm signed in and I'm assigned a subscription, I have access now to the subscription keys right from within here. So I don't have to go ahead and ask my administrator to send me a subscription key. I can just find it right here. And actually, that's it for the first scenario. That's all you can do. You can, of course, add another identity provider. So if you click add right here, you will find, Azure AD. And you used to be able to do Facebook, Google, Microsoft, and Twitter, but now you don't need to, because you already have B2C. So if you need Facebook, Google, Microsoft, or Twitter, you can just do it via the B2C user flow, or like the B2C tenant. So you could come here and identity providers, and then add whatever identity provider you need. And so basically the only two things you need now is Azure AD and Azure AD B2C. This could be for like internal developers, and the B2C could be for external developers. Or you could just depend on just B2C only and have your B2C federate with your Active Directory via the OpenID Connect provider. So there are many ways to skin a cat here, but it doesn't really matter. And that's it for scenario one. So let's move ahead to the second scenario. And in the second scenario, we are going to allow the developer to issue tokens from B2C and use it in the API call. In order to do this, you go to the identity provider again, and then click on OAuth2 and OpenID Connect. Now you can do that using OAuth, just plain old OAuth, or you can do OpenID Connect, which is an extension above OAuth. I'm just gonna do OAuth here because there is really, like, think of the use case that you're trying to do. All you're trying to do is authorize the developer to call the API. Now, you would need OpenID Connect if the identity is important for the underlying API. Like if the underlying API needs to know who the caller is. But in our use case, for example, it's just a weather app that brings the weather, so it doesn't matter who the user is. It's just going to work regardless. So OAuth here is good enough for me. Like if you could do OAuth, you could do OpenID Connect as well. It's really easy. So the display name here again is going to be the like you could call it anything, and the authorization server description, I don't need that. So the client registration page URL, something like placeholder dot like this. And what kind of authorization grants I'm going to allow? Well, the authorization code grant is available for me to use. I can use any of these, they all work, but however, you need to make sure that the sign-on flow that you created can support it. So we do know that we support the authorization code flow. We could also support implicit, since implicit is available as well for us on the app registration. So the authorization endpoint URL should be something like this. It's just gonna be the tenant name .bdc login.com slash, and then the tenant name again .onmicrosoft.com, and then you have to mention the policy to use, so bdc _1 sign up sign in, and then OAuth version 2 authorize. I think that's right. It's mentioned in the documentation right here, not just OAuth authorize. And the token endpoint is exactly the same, except in the end, I want the token endpoint. So that's good. You can, if your OAuth provider, now this will work for any OAuth provider, not just BDC. And if it needs additional parameters, you can add the additional parameters right here. You can choose how to pass them in the body or basic. And then the access token sending message. We know that BDC sends the token back in the query. So we have to choose query parameters here. But again, it depends on your OAuth provider or your IDP. And again, we need the client credentials. So I'm going to go back to my app registration. And we can use the same app registration or we can create a new one. I'm just going to use the same one and copy the client ID, paste it right here, and the client secret. And now for this to work, I need to put those URLs in the redirect URL in my application registration. So I'm just going to copy this, go back to the app registration, click on authorization. Now we already have this first one for the, the first scenario. Now the second scenario needs a couple more. So that's the one. And then there is another one if I want to enable the implicit flow. Now for OIDC, those are going to be different. So just if you're using OIDC, grab the right URL. Now again, you could choose a default scope, and that's if there is like a default scope you want to grab. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to leave it as is, because in the API itself, you can, for each individual API, you can choose to issue, a token with a different scope. So, and that's what we're going to do, because you need to minimize the request for scopes as much as possible as a best practice. So we're going to create, and we're going to go see what effect does that have on the portal. So, and try it. Well, no effect. That's because we have not told this API to actually go ahead and use the OAuth provider we've defined. So now we can come back here, APIs, and I'll just use this default Echo API for now, and just to show you what it does. And settings, and you enable OAuth 2.0. You select the server that you just defined. Then yet again, you're gonna go and republish the portal so that these changes take effect. So publishing once again, and now it could take a couple of minutes to reflect. Good, so we can now refresh this page. Click try, and now we can see this. And now let's go ahead and try to issue a token. So I can do an authorization code. Now that automatically pops up this window here, and that pops up all this window here, and I have an error message, and that's probably because I misconfigured the URL, let me just double check it. Yeah, it should be OAuth2, not OAuth, so that's my bad. So I'm just gonna go back and change it right here. And this should be OAuth2 and OAuth2 and save. Okay, now I have to go and republish. Okay, let's try again. Yeah, now I get a different error message. It says the request does not contain the scope parameter. And I did that deliberately. I just wanted to show you that if you don't provide a default scope while you're configuring the OAuth itself from here, like this, and you also don't provide a scope in the API, you can't actually get the token. You need a scope, like what's the scope of this token, what APIs can it talk to. So for now, just to circumvent this problem, I'm just gonna request the OpenID scope. So that should bring in an ID token. And I'll republish the portal once again. Okay, now let's try it for one last time. And now it's prompting me to log in. So I will log in using the account I already created when I signed up. Good, and now you can see I'm getting the authorization token right here, and it automatically filled it for me. Now, if I send this request, you can see it succeeds, and it also, because that's the default behavior of API management, is that it forwards the authorization token onto the backend API or the underlying API, which in our case here is the Echo API. However, that Echo API doesn't know how to deal with it. Like, it completely ignores the fact that it's getting a token passed. So that's just something you should be mindful of, is that in reality, this has no bearing on the underlying API unless the underlying API wants to take advantage of it. All this does is it provides us with the mechanism that we can choose right here to pass in a token. That's all. If we don't pass in a token, for example, if I do no auth here and that removes the header, this request is going to work regardless, right? Because it's fine with not having a token. It's still going to work. And that brings us to the third scenario, actually, which is, I want to actually secure my API using Azure AD B2C. I want the APIM gateway to require a token from me, because otherwise, all what I did is just present a user with a way to issue a token, but there is nothing that really validates it. So we're gonna go ahead and modify APIM and force it to validate JWTs, issued by B2C. So the first thing we want to do is actually go to our code, and let's publish an API that takes advantage of, validating tokens using B2C. So the first thing I'm going to do is just go to the app settings right here, and I'm going to paste this following snippet, and I need to modify that. So this is my tenant name, and again, I do the same thing here, and I need a tenant ID and a client ID, so I can go back to my B2C tenant, and this is the tenant ID. Okay, and now a client ID, and now that's not the same client ID as before, because the client ID we did before represents APIM. I need another app registration to represent this API, this backend API. So I can go back here, app registration, new registration, and this I'm just gonna call it weather API. So again, I can leave this redirect URI empty, and I wanna tell B2C that this application actually exposes an API. So I'm gonna click on expose API right here. First thing I need to do is to set the application ID URI. I'm just gonna use the same client ID right here. And if you're not familiar with this process, there are many videos on the web that just explain how to expose APIs. I'm just gonna keep it simple here, and the scope we wanna expose is weather.read, right? Reads weather forecast, and that allows user to request a weather forecast. All right, that is all I need to do here. And now I can go back to my code and just copy that client ID first and paste it here. And again, you have to mention the sign-in policy. And I'm just gonna copy this, put it in the development as well, because I might need this to be available for both production and development. Now we go to program.cs and we're just gonna request those. And here we want to teach our API to validate tokens using B2C. So I'm just gonna paste a snippet of code here. And basically what that does is it adds authentication to the app, and I'm just binding the JWT bearer options to whatever options I have in my app settings. And then I need to go under here and add those two lines as well. So I add authentication, add authorization. Now that I added authorization, I can actually set my API to request authorization and add this line as well, which basically requires this API call to be authorized. And this is the authentication scheme we're going to be using. It's the same authentication scheme as we had in here. Good. So now I can just test whether this is running or not by just testing it locally first. I just want to make sure that this API actually works. So it is right now, it's published, and now I can go back and make a local call again. And now I get a 401 unauthorized as opposed to what I had before. So in order to authorize the call, you're going to have to pass in an authorization header. And I don't have a token, so I can go ahead and issue one first. So the easiest way to issue a token is just to go back to Azure Active Directory B2C, and I'm just going to create a new registration. I'm going to call it jwt.ms, and the redirect URL is https jwt.ms, and you need to enable the implicit flow right here and save. And now you can go back to the user flow, and I just want to issue a token, so I'll go choose this, and there you go. I can see my token, and you can see all the details, all the claims we requested in the token, all of them are there. Nothing really special here. So I'll go back to this, and I'll actually paste the bearer token right here. And now let's make a request again. And now we get this error, which is the audience is invalid. And that's because that token represents this application, which is jwt.ms. But I did not grant access from this application to the API. So I need to go back to the app registration, go to this app registration, expose and API permissions, and add a permission to my API. And you need to grant admin consent. And what that does is it just allows the tokens issued for this client ID to also contact this API. So now I can go ahead and try again. Now I need to issue a different token. So back to user flows, and we're gonna do this a bunch of times. So every time I issue a new token, I'm just gonna cut the video a little bit so that you don't get bored. And now the difference is here this time. I'm actually going to check that I actually need access to the weather.read scope. And now let's try again. And there you go. Now it's working. So now this API properly validates the token via B2C. But here we had to, of course, issue the token manually. That's fine for now. Now let's go ahead and publish this application to the cloud. Good, and the publishing is complete, so I can now go back here and try the published version. And again, I still have, it hasn't been that long, so the token should still be active, and we get a response back. So now let's see what happens when I configure this API on API-M. So I'm gonna go back to APIs, and I'm just gonna add an HTTP API. I want the full details, and I'm just gonna call this weather API. The backend URL service, I can just copy it from here. And I'm gonna add this to both products and create. Now I'm gonna add an operation, and the operation name is weather forecast. The URL is /weather forecast. So nothing really special here. Now I'm gonna save. And now if I go back to my portal right here, and let's go back to the home page, go to APIs, I can find the weather API right here. If I try to get the weather forecast and I send, I get the 401 unauthorized as expected, because I need a bearer token to be able to talk to it. So we go back to API management. I click on the settings of the API, and again I do OAuth, and then I of course must override the scope, because we know we need a specific scope, which is weather.read, right? So now once I save this, this still doesn't work, because the the application registration that represents API management does not know how to issue tokens for this specified scope. So again, you have to come back, app registrations, and the API management app registration, API permissions, and once again, similarly to what we did with the other app, is to add the weather.read. And again, we must grant consent. Now that that's granted, now it knows how to issue such tokens. And just a small correction here, the actual name of the scope that you need to override must actually contain the entire name of the scope. And we can grab the name of the scope from here, weather API, and just copy the scope name and paste it right here. So that's the full name of the scope that we want to request. And we get an authorization bearer token here. And let's send it. And we get a response back, right? So now all that the portal is doing, by the way, is just I issued a bearer token right here, and it just put it in the request. So I could quite easily do the same thing like this. So now think about what did we accomplish here, is that the API is already configured to take advantage of B2C. And all I needed API management for is just to pass in the token, and the authorization itself is done on the API level. So instead of doing that, can we actually offload this process onto API management? And that's what scenario 3 is for. As we see here, we need to place a lock right here. So let's take a look at this. And now for this instance, I'm going to use the Echo API as my test subject because it's already unprotected. And I want to show you that even for an unprotected API, you can offer that sort of protection. So I'm going to keep it as is right here. And I'm going to click on all operations, make sure I'm clicking on all operations, and click on policies right here. And if you look at the documentation for the third scenario, you're going to find a bit of code that you can paste. I'm just going to copy and paste it right here, and we're going to fill it together. So what that does, it adds the ability for the API gateway to authorize the tokens being passed. So it's not just merely passing the token through, it validates it before passing it through. So like it's going to error out if the token is invalid, and now we need an OpenID config URL. The config URL is simply the tenant name, and here the tenant name again. And this is the B2C _1 _ sign up sign in flow. Then V2 well-known OpenID configuration. And that's like, if you go to this URL, you should find a JSON document just describing all the requirements here for the token authorization, like the JWKS URI. This is where all the keys are that's going to use to validate the tokens and so on. So we have to pass this to API management so that it knows how to configure it. You can also validate the audience, and I'm not gonna do that in that case because like I have no specific audience for this. The audience is basically the API you're targeting. Well, the Echo API doesn't have an app registration, so I'm just gonna remove this altogether. But you can put it in, like in case you were doing it for the weather API, you would put in the audience the client ID of the weather API. It's that simple. And the issuer is with which tenant issued this token, and again you put the name of the tenant, and then here you put the tenant ID, so you can go ahead and grab the tenant ID from anywhere, and that's it. There are additional options that you can set here in the validate JWT. So you can specify, check if the token is expired, what is the clock skew, and so on. So there is quite a bit of parameters you can pass into this piece of code, but we're just going to do this very simply. And let's go back to the portal, and now this time the Echo API. Now, even though the underlying API is unprotected, if I try to access it right now, it's bringing an error like CORS is not enabled, but if you would enable the CORS, you would see that the request couldn't be completed because 401 unauthorized. But now I'm going to issue a token, and now let's send it, and now this time it brings 200 OK because the token could be verified. So now what we did is that we took a unsecured backend API and we put on top of it some sort of security using the APIM gateway. Now we validate the token that is issued from B2C specifically before we can let the call through. Now, the fourth scenario, we will take advantage of the already secure backend API. But what we want to do this time, let's go to the weather API again. And what we want to do is we want to send a non-authenticated call right here. And this non-authenticated call, of course, is going to give us 401 unauthorized. So maybe it's enough for me that the subscription key is here, and I don't need any bearer authentication on top of that. So I don't want to pass in a bearer token in the header, but I still want to be able to access the API. So I should expect API Manager to actually do that or grab that token on my behalf and use it to call the underlying API. So there is a big gotcha here, is that API management is an application, so it's not a user. Like it can't generate an ID token for me, or a token that contains my identity. It's merely an application. So we're going to have to depend on client credentials flow, or the client credentials grant in order to issue a successful token, and that means we need to enable the client credentials grant for B2C. So the way it works is, you go to the app registration representing API management, and you want to add an additional permission, but this time it's going to be an application permission. So you add a permission, but as you can see, the application permissions here are dimmed, like you can't do that. And that's because the weather API does not have the roles required for it to be added as an application permission. So first we have to go back to the weather API and go to the manifest. And I'm just gonna paste this little snippet here in the app roles. And what that does, it allows member type application that basically now it can be added as an application permission, and you just have to add some parameters right here. You will find this code snippet in the code repository associated with this video, so that I know there is a little bit of bits and pieces all over the place in this video. So all those snippets you are going to find in the description. So now you can save that. And now we have to go back to APIM app registration, API permissions. Now let's try to add it again. Now the application permission is available. So I'm just gonna click it here, add the permission. And now I also need to grant the admin consent, of course. So that's done. So now this application is ready to request, client credential tokens. Okay, so now that we've configured this part, now let's actually try to make a request and issue a client credentials token. We can just come here, and there are a few things to be mindful of. The first thing is take a look at the endpoint that we're talking to. It is not, the usual, tenant name .b2c login.com anymore. It is actually login.microsoftonline.com. And the reason being, B2C does not support client credentials grant. So we have to fall back to the underlying Azure AD endpoint, which basically sits on login.microsoftonline.com. And then, of course, we provide the tenant ID and then OAuth version 2/token. Notice we also don't mention the policy name because there are no policies. This is Azure AD, not Azure AD B2C. So, or rather the endpoint we're talking to. So we don't need to put that part right here. We can just talk to the endpoint like so. To issue a token using a client credentials grant, we need to pass 4 parameters. The first parameter is the client ID. The second parameter is the scope, and then the client secret and the grant type. So the client ID is basically the ID of the application that's going to make the request. In our case, that's API management. So you can come here and grab that client ID. I've already did here. In the scope, this is the client ID of the API you're trying to talk to. And then you add /.default. This is a B2C thing, and that's basically because you cannot choose scopes or specific scopes when you're making a client credentials grant request. Instead, you just choose the /default, and that assumes that you have access to any underlying API under that client ID. So you just choose /default, and that's just going to bring you the application roles available for that application, that correspond to this ID. So I'm going to show you in the token after a minute what that means. And then, of course, the client secret, and the grant type is client credential. So now let's try to issue a token and see what happens. And we get a token back, so I'll just copy that token. Let's go to jwt.ms and let's see what the token look like. So the difference here, it just basically says what's the issuer of this token. And again, the issuer is login.microsoftonline.com / the tenant ID / v2. Just something to be mindful of, because we're going to need to verify that using our API later. And the audience is, this ID of my API. Again, we're going to need to verify using our API. And the roles here is the reader role. And if you remember, that's the role that we just exposed the permission for right here. And this comes via the scope that we chose. So we chose basically bring me all the scopes that correspond to this API application ID, right? And the scopes that it could find is reader. That's the only one. So it brought it into the roles right here. And you can check that in your API. And quite honestly, you don't need to, as long as it's just the audience matches is going to be fine. Now, this is B2C specific a little bit. If you're using, Identity Server or Okta or something like that, probably you don't need to do any of that stuff that we mentioned, because we went through a lot of hoops in order to allow the client credentials grant to work. But, in Identity Server, for example, it just comes out of the box. So just something to be mindful of. And now let's try to take that token that we have here and try to talk to our application. So let's talk to it. And it says the signature is invalid. That is, of course, to be expected, because if you take a look at the application code we only verify tokens from Azure AD B2C. But as we discussed, this token did not get issued from Azure AD B2C. It got issued from the underlying Azure AD infrastructure of Azure AD B2C. So again, this is very specific to B2C, but what you need to do here is you're going to have to teach your API to verify two different types of token. One issued by B2C and the other one is issued by AD. And the way you do that is just you come above this one and you just I'm going to paste a little bit of code snippet here. And that adds the capability to verify JWT bearer tokens. And I'm going to have a different authentication scheme name here, which is Azure AD. And the options of it are, there are only two things I need, the authority and the audience. So the authority is who is this API going to contact in order to get the keys to verify the token. And you just give it the name of the endpoint / the tenant ID. And in the audience part, you mention what is the client ID of this API. And that's, of course, the client ID of the Weather API app registration that we created earlier. And then you can also edit the token validation parameters. And that's basically, what do you want to check in the token? Well, I want to check it has valid issuers as such. And the issuer here is, again, the endpoint of Azure AD / the tenant ID and then v2. And the valid audiences again. So if you think about it, we're teaching our API to check for those two values, right? I want to check those two values are exactly the same, because that proves that the token was issued from my tenant, and it also targets this specific API, right? And that's as simple as it can be. Now, if you publish this, it's still not going to work, because our controller only verifies tokens from Azure AD. So we're going to have to add an additional authentication scheme here as well, and that's going to be the Azure AD one. And again, that's the same name as I specified right here. Okay. And then let's publish this and see if it works. Okay, so now it has been published. So I can come back here and let's try to issue a new token. Just to get a new token, because the old one might be expired. And let's come here, put it in the header and make the request. And it works. So now I can verify tokens issued either by Azure AD or Azure AD B2C. Both are going to work. So what do we need to do now? We basically need to simulate this process using API management. So API management is going to get like a naked request without any authorization on it, and it's going to issue the token on my behalf and then use the token to contact the underlying API. So let's see how it's done. So I go back to my APIs right here, and here is the weather API. And if you remember, we had in the settings, we had already required authorization for this API, and now we're going to turn off that option. So we're not going to require authorization for this API. We're just going to allow users to call it without any authorization whatsoever. There's still, of course, a subscription key, so it's not like completely out there without protection, but just worth saying. And now instead of this authorization, I'm going to issue my own token and talk to the underlying API. So I come here to all operations policies, and I'm gonna paste a bit of code here. And the code I've pasted basically sends an HTTP request, and the response is going to be saved in a variable called bearer token. That HTTP request that we are using is exactly the same as this request, right? So the URL I'm talking to, again, is the same, right? And again, note I'm talking to login.microsoftonline, not to the b2clogin.com. And again, the content type is URL encoded, and then the body of the request has the client ID. It also has the scope, and it has the client secret, and it has the grant type, which is client credentials, right? All in good order. And then what happens after that is it takes the token resulting, like the response is going to be saved in a variable called bearer token. So I need to attach that into the authorization header before I pass it to the underlying API. So I set a header named authorization, so that creates the authorization header, and the contents of it, or the value of it, are going to be bearer plus, and then this piece of string right here. And that basically extracts from the context variable, this variable, and then it traverses inside that, because this is a JSON object, so it traverses inside the JSON object to get the access token. Because if you look at the response we get from here, this is a JSON object, and what we want is the access token variable right here, right? So that's basically what it does. And then on top of that, it does something interesting here. It removes or clears out the subscription key from the header before forwarding the request along to the backend API. And this is a standard practice because you might be talking to a third-party API, and of course you don't want to send the subscription keys of your customers onto the third-party API just to avoid leaks or anything like that. So it's always useful to just clear out the subscription key before forwarding the request. That actually should be a standard practice everywhere in API management. However, yeah, that's all you need to do. You can just save this now. And now let's try and see if it works. So you can go to the developer portal, and let's refresh this, the weather API. And now you see it's not requesting us to supply a bearer token anymore. And that's what we did here, is we're going to allow users to just send the request, right? And the request is successful. So what happened behind the scene, we can actually test this. And I can show you what happened behind the scenes is if you click on this method and test. So if you click on the trace, you see in the inbound section, where is it? Yeah, I'm just setting the body, and then it's gonna make the request. So it's sending the request and sent a post request to this URL with the parameters we specified in the body. Good. So the status code is okay, and we have a result stored in the bearer token variable. Good. And there is the evaluation of the set header method, which adds the authorization header, adds the value bearer plus whatever came into here. So here is the end value that we can see, and then added the authorization header and removed the subscription key, and then it made the request to the backend, and you can see the request that was made had the authorization bearer token in it. So it basically did this on my behalf. Now, again, let me reiterate what we said in the intro. This is going, every time you make this request, it's going to issue a new token. That is not the correct thing to do. This is a very, very bad practice, because your identity provider is going to hate you, and it probably has some sort of limit anyway, that if you keep issuing tokens endlessly, very quickly from the same IP address or something, it's just going to block those requests eventually or something like that. So there are always limits on IDPs, it can't just generate a token for every request. It doesn't make sense. So what you should do here, and I'm not going to do that because that gets into like the details of writing API management policies, and that's a whole topic on its own. But what you should do here is actually, before sending the request, you should have some sort of token caching or some kind of cache, that you issue a request to the cache first, see if you have a token, and then validate the token. And you can validate the token using the same way we did in scenario 3, and see if the token is still valid. And if the token is still valid, then you can just reuse it without trying to issue a new token. But if it's not valid, then only then you create a new token and then put it in the cache for the next request to find it. That's just one way of doing it. And to be honest, I also don't think that client credentials is very secure. Like, think about, well, it's secure enough maybe, but think about like every time you need to change the client secrets, you're going to have to delve into this policy and change the client secrets somehow. And yes, I know that you can put named values in API management so that you can save your keys here and look at it from the policy. I know you can do that, but it's still one piece of configuration that you're going to have to save elsewhere. So a better thing to do here would be, if you have an API management talking to an underlying API, a better thing to do would be to use client certificates. But that's not available for everyone. Maybe your platform does not support client certificates, which hosts the underlying API, or you don't want to modify the underlying API. It already uses OAuth and you just want to continue using OAuth for it. That's all valid scenarios. So just know that if you can, try to avoid making a request to issue a new token every time. And that actually brings us full circle. We have looked at all the four scenarios in that case. And just to reiterate, the first two scenarios are fairly cosmetic. They basically don't do anything affecting the API gateway itself. They only affect the UI of the developer portal so that users can sign in and you can assign products to them and subscriptions to them. And the second scenario just gives you this small widget in the interface that you can try your APIs, and it's just there to help you generate the token that you need to make the API call, but it doesn't do anything on its own. Now, scenario 3 and scenario 4, this is where the real action is basically, you can actually teach API management to validate tokens issued from B2C, and you can teach API management to issue tokens that your backend APIs expect. And with that actually concludes the session, and thank you very much for watching. I know it's a long video and some parts of it were pretty complicated. You're going to find all the code for the API, all the code snippets that we put in each and every part of throughout this process. I'm just going to put those things into the description, so you're going to find them. I'm also going to share all the links for the official documentation for all those four scenarios. The reason I made this video is just when people talk about B2C integration with API management, no one knows exactly okay, how many different scenarios are there, or what do you mean by integration between B2C and API management? So now we know there are four scenarios that you can do, and you can mix and match those four scenarios, and you can actually make one big scenario that combines all four of them. That's all fine, but just now you understand all the different bits and pieces that formulate this relationship. And it's also worth mentioning that most of the things that we did here can work with things other than B2C. So this, for example, can work with any OAuth provider so does this one, so does this one. So it's not specific to B2C, but I chose B2C here because it has some intricacies in the way you configure those things with it, and also they just work well together when you work with API management and B2C. So thank you very much for watching again, and until the next time.